What happens when a ruthless underworld kingpin stares down the barrel of a rival's gun, only to realize the trembling Omega in the corner is carrying the one thing his billions couldn't buy, a secret heir. Brace yourself for a tale of power, betrayal, and deadly obsession. Manhattan's skyline offered no comfort to a man who owned half of it and bled for the rest. Damian Castellano stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Tribeca penthouse, his reflection a portrait of lethal composure. To the readers of Forbes, Damian was the untouchable CEO of Castellano Global Logistics, a legitimate shipping empire with a valuation north of $15 billion. To the whispers in the dark alleys of Hell's Kitchen and the heavily guarded back rooms of the Five Boroughs, he was the apex predator of the Italian-American syndicate, an alpha so dominant, so ruthlessly powerful, that other alphas lowered their gazes in his presence. His pheromones were a weapon. His silence was a threat. His presence alone could make the strongest men tremble. Damian's life was an exercise in absolute control. Every variable was calculated. Every enemy tracked. Every alliance bought and paid for. He wore bespoke Brioni suits, checked the time on a platinum Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, and trusted no one. Love was a liability he had violently excised from his life years ago. He had watched his own father, a powerful alpha, reduced to a weeping shell by the death of his Omega mate. Damian had sworn then, never would he allow another person to hold that kind of power over him. Never would he let himself be vulnerable to that kind of loss. Yet there was a single unpredictable anomaly in his meticulously curated existence. A ghost from exactly 9 months prior. It had been a crisp October evening at the Waldorf Astoria. Damian was hosting a high society charity gala, a perfect front to launder both his reputation and several $1 million. He hadn't planned on the Torres family, a bitter rival faction from Philadelphia, staging a brazen assassination attempt in the middle of the ballroom. When the silenced gunfire erupted, shattering crystal chandeliers and sending Manhattan's elites screaming into the corridors, chaos had reigned. In the blind rush for the exits, Damian had spotted him. Elliot Chun. Elliot wasn't a socialite or a politician's son. He was a freelance floral designer hired by a Brooklyn botanical firm to arrange the white orchids on the tables. A quiet, unassuming Omega with gentle hands and a smile that could soften the hardest heart. Caught in the crossfire, he had frozen, terrified, clutching a stray stem as a Torres hitman raised his weapon toward him, mistaking him for one of Damian's associates. Damian didn't know why he moved. It was a lapse in judgment, an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He had tackled Elliot behind a marble pillar, neutralizing the shooter with 2 suppressed rounds from his concealed Glock 19. Dragging him through a hidden service corridor, he forced him into a subterranean panic room beneath the hotel. For 12 hours, they were locked in complete darkness while Damian's men purged the building above. The air in the bunker had been thick with terror. Elliot had sobbed uncontrollably, his delicate frame shaking against the cold steel walls. His scent, honey and chamomile, sweet and distressed, filled the confined space, triggering something primal in Damian's alpha instincts. Damian, a man who traded in fear, found himself doing something utterly foreign, comforting him. In the pitch black, stripped of his wealth, his name, and his terrifying reputation, he was just a voice in the dark. A protector. "It's okay," Damian had murmured, his voice rough in the darkness. "I won't let anything happen to you. You're safe." Who are you?" Elliot's voice was small, trembling. "Someone who's going to get you out of here alive. That's all you need to know." The adrenaline, the proximity of death, and the desperate need for a lifeline had ignited a reckless, consuming fire between them. It wasn't romance. It was survival. A profound trauma-bonded collision of 2 souls in the absolute dark. In those hours, Damian had learned that Elliot was 23, a recent graduate of the New York Botanical Gardens horticulture program, working 3 jobs to support himself. He was an Omega, unpresented until his 20s, and still learning to navigate a world that often dismissed him. He had no family to speak of. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 18, and he'd been on his own ever since. Damien, by contrast, had told him nothing. Not his name, not his position, not the blood that stained his hands. When the all-clear finally sounded at dawn, Damien had made a cold, calculated decision to protect them both. He left Elliot there with a duffel bag containing $500,000 in untraceable bills and a single handwritten note. Asterisk, forget this night. Disappear. Asterisk. By the time Elliot blinked into the harsh lights of the security team, Damien was a ghost. He spent months hunting down the Torres family for the insult, practically ignoring the lingering memory of the florist with the amber eyes. He assumed Elliot had taken the money and started a new life far away from the bloodstained streets of his world. He was wrong. The harsh vibration of his encrypted satellite phone shattered the silence of his penthouse. Damien answered without a word. Boss. The gravelly voice of his underboss, Mateo. We have a situation. Valentin Torres is making a final desperate play. He just hit the First Manhattan Private Depository on Fifth Avenue. Broad daylight. Damien's jaw tightened. The depository wasn't a normal bank. It was a fortress holding off-the-books assets for the world's most dangerous people. Box 404 belonged to Damien. Inside was a ledger containing the routing numbers for offshore accounts holding billions, along with hard evidence of political bribes that could dismantle the Castellano Empire overnight. He's cornered, Damien stated, his voice a chilling monotone. NYPD will have the block locked down in minutes. Why hit it now? Because he knows he's dead anyway, Mateo replied. He's heavily armed. 6 men. He's taken 9 hostages. And boss, Valentin knows you have the NYPD captain on your payroll. He's demanding you come into the bank alone to negotiate for the ledger, or he starts executing civilians on a live feed. He wants to drag you down with him. Damien checked his reflection one last time. His eyes were dead and unreadable. At 34, he had survived more assassination attempts than he could count. He had buried rivals, betrayed allies, and climbed to the top of a mountain made of bones. He had never felt fear. Not once. But something stirred in his chest. Something cold and sharp. Get the armored Maybach. Have our tactical team secure the perimeter behind the police line. Tell Captain O'Malley to hold his SWAT units back. I'm going in. Red and blue strobes painted the facades of Fifth Avenue's luxury boutiques. The First Manhattan Private Depository was surrounded. Barricades were up, and heavily armored police officers crouched behind their cruisers, rifles trained on the heavy bronze doors of the bank. Damien stepped out of the black Maybach, adjusting his cuffs. Captain O'Malley, sweating profusely despite the chill in the air, jogged over to him. Castellano, this is a disaster. O'Malley hissed, keeping his voice low. The feds are 10 minutes away from taking over my scene. Torres is unhinged. He shot a security guard in the knee just to prove a point. You have exactly 7 minutes before I am legally forced to send my tactical teams through the glass. Call your dogs off, O'Malley, Damien said smoothly, bypassing the barricade without waiting for permission. If SWAT breaches, Torres detonates the C for he undoubtedly strapped to the vault door. Let me speak to him. Damien walked up the granite steps alone. His hands were empty. His posture relaxed. He was walking into a slaughterhouse, but his heart beat at a steady resting rhythm. He pushed open the shattered glass of the entrance and stepped into the sprawling marble-floored lobby. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and copper. 2 of Torres's men, holding Heckler Koch MP5 submachine guns, immediately trained their lasers on Damien's chest. Pat him down. A raspy, monotone voice echoed through the cavernous room. Valentin Torres stepped out from the hallway leading to the vaults. He looked exactly like a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. His bespoke suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, and he twirled a heavy magnum revolver in his hand. Damien allowed the thugs to relieve him of his hidden combat knife and his Glock. He kept his eyes locked on Valentin. You're a dead man, Valentin. The only thing we are negotiating today is whether you leave this building in handcuffs or in a body bag. Arrogant to the end, Damien. Valentin laughed, a harsh grating sound. I don't plan on leaving. I plan on streaming the contents of Box 404 to the New York Times. I'm going to burn your empire to the ground. But first, I needed you here to watch it happen. Damien's gaze swept the room, taking stock of the tactical layout. 2 shooters by the door. Valentine in the center. 1 by the vault. And in the far corner, near the shattered teller windows, huddled a group of 9 hostages. They were zip-tied to each other, weeping silently, their faces pressed toward the floor. Let the civilians go, Valentine, Damien said, his tone bored. They have nothing to do with our business. It's bad form. Since when do you care about collateral damage? Valentine sneered, walking over to the huddle of hostages. He kicked the nearest one, an elderly man in a suit. These people are my insurance that your pet cops outside don't try anything stupid. Damien's eyes tracked Valentine's movements. And as the rival boss shifted, Damien finally saw him. Sitting against the polished mahogany desk, his head bowed, was Elliot Chun. Damien's breath hitched a microfraction of a second, invisible to anyone but him. The world around him went completely silent. The ringing in his ears drowned out Valentine's rambling monologue. Elliot was wearing a simple beige trench coat now, stained with soot and ash from the initial breach. His dark hair was messy, hanging in his face as silent tears tracked through the dirt on his cheeks. But it wasn't his presence that made the blood freeze in Damien's veins. It was the way he was sitting. His wrists were bound in front of him, but his hands were aggressively, protectively curled around his midsection. His coat was open, revealing a highly prominent, heavy rounded belly. He was pregnant, at least 8 months along. Damien's brilliant tactical mind executed the math with ruthless efficiency. 9 months ago, the Waldorf Astoria, the panic room. He had left Elliot with cash to start over. But he had left him with something else too. He was carrying Damien's child. A violent, primal wave of possessiveness crashed over him, so intense it physically hurt. His heir, the Castellano bloodline growing inside an Omega who was currently sitting 2 feet away from a madman with a loaded revolver. Damien had spent his entire life burying his emotions, viewing attachments as weaknesses. But in that singular agonizing moment, watching Elliot flinch as Valentine paced near him, Damien realized he would happily burn the entire city of New York to ash to keep him safe. He forced his face into a mask of total indifference. If Valentine Torres saw even a glimmer of recognition in Damien's eyes, Elliot would instantly become the most valuable pawn in the history of the Mafia. Valentine would put a gun to his head and make Damien dismantle his own empire piece by piece. You're wasting my time, Valentine, Damien droned, intentionally turning his back slightly on the hostages to draw Valentine's attention away from them. You can't get into Box 404. It requires dual biometric scans, my fingerprint and my retina. Unless you plan on cutting off my hand and scooping out my eye right here in the lobby. Valentine smiled a wicked, jagged grin. That was exactly the plan, Damien. Elliot let out a quiet, terrified sob, shifting uncomfortably against the hard floor. The sound was faint, but to Damien it was deafening. He saw Elliot's gaze flicker up for a fraction of a second. His amber eyes met Damien's dark ones. The shock that washed over his pale face was absolute. He recognized him. The man from the dark. The savior who had abandoned him. The alpha father of his unborn child. He opened his mouth, a desperate plea forming on his lips. Damien gave him an imperceptible, terrifyingly cold glare. Do not speak. Elliot swallowed hard, clamping his mouth shut and burying his face against his knees, wrapping his bound arms tighter around their baby. Shut up back there. Valentine barked, spinning around and pointing the heavy magnum at the hostages. He marched toward Elliot, annoyed by his crying. I said quiet. Damien's muscles coiled like a striking viper. He measured the distance. 12 feet. 2 armed guards between him and Valentine. Valentine reached down and grabbed a fistful of Elliot's hair, yanking his head back. Elliot cried out in pain, his hands instinctively flying up to protect his stomach. You sniveling little. Valentine snarled, pressing the cold steel of the gun barrel against Elliot's temple. Damien's world went red. The calculated, legitimate businessman vanished. The apex predator was unleashed. Violence erupted with the speed of a camera flash. Damien did not draw a weapon, nor did he shout a warning. He simply became a weapon. In a fraction of a second, he pivoted on his heel, driving his elbow into the throat of the guard to his left with a sickening crunch. As the man collapsed, gagging for air, Damien snatched the falling MP5 submachine gun from his grasp. Before the second guard by the entrance could even register the movement, Damien squeezed the trigger, sending a short, controlled burst into the man's tactical vest, dropping him instantly. Valentine spun away from Elliot, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. He raised the heavy magnum, but Damien was already moving, closing the 12-foot gap with terrifying speed. "Kill him!" Valentine shrieked to his remaining men near the vault. Gunfire tore through the pristine lobby of the First Manhattan Private Depository. Marble columns shattered, sending razor-sharp shrapnel raining down onto the polished floors. Damien dove behind a heavy oak teller desk, returning fire with lethal precision. He took out the guard by the vault with a single shot through the visor of his helmet, leaving only Valentine and one other shooter. But Damien's primary focus wasn't neutralizing the threat. It was the terrified Omega curled into a ball just yards away. Elliot had pressed himself flat against the mahogany desk, his arms wrapped protectively around his swollen belly as bullets chewed through the wood above his head. "Elliot, stay down." Damien roared over the deafening echo of automatic fire. Hearing him speak his name sent a fresh wave of shock through Elliot's system. But he didn't move. Valentine, realizing his grand plan was disintegrating, grabbed Elliot by the collar of his trench coat, hauling him up as a human shield. He pressed the barrel of his revolver against Elliot's pregnant stomach. "Drop the gun, Castellano, or your little collateral damage here takes a hollow point." Damien froze. The MP5 in his hands lowered slightly. His eyes, cold and dark as a winter ocean, locked onto Valentine's. "You pull that trigger, Torres, and I promise you, death will be a luxury you will beg me for. I will dismantle your entire family. I will burn your legacy out of the history books." "Drop it!" Valentine screamed, his hands shaking. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing quietly. "Please," he whispered. "Please don't." Damien's mind raced through every tactical scenario. The angles were wrong. If he shot Valentine, the dead man's reflex might cause him to clench the trigger. He couldn't risk the baby. He couldn't risk Elliot. Slowly, deliberately, Damien placed the MP5 on the marble floor and kicked it away. He raised his hands, submitting to a lesser man for the first time in his life. Valentine laughed, a manic, breathless sound. "Look at you, the great Damien Castellano, brought to his knees by a nobody." But Valentine didn't know the full truth of the board he was playing on. As Valentine gloated, one of the hostages, a young man in a delivery uniform who had been weeping silently on the floor, suddenly sat up. His zip ties were already sliced through. From beneath his jacket, he drew a suppressed Sig Sauer P226. It wasn't one of Valentine's men. It was a mole. But not Torres's mole. It was Lorenzo, one of Damien's top enforcers, planted in the bank as a civilian weeks ago, precisely to guard the contents of box 404 from internal threats. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. Two silenced rounds caught Valentine in the shoulder and knee. Valentine screamed, his grip on Elliot loosening as he collapsed to the marble floor. Damien exploded forward. He didn't go for a gun. He tackled Elliot, wrapping his large, muscular frame completely around him as Valentine wildly fired a blind shot from the ground. The heavy magnum round grazed Damien's ribcage, tearing through his Brioni suit and carving a line of fire across his side. But he barely grunted. He hoisted Elliot off the ground, carrying him bridal style as he sprinted toward the heavy reinforced steel doors of the vault hallway. Lorenzo provided cover fire, executing the final Torres gunman before dragging the bleeding Valentine by the collar toward the vault. "Get inside now," Lorenzo shouted, punching the emergency lockdown sequence on the keypad. Damien carried Elliot into the cavernous, titanium-reinforced main vault, setting him gently on a stack of velvet-lined safety deposit boxes. Lorenzo threw Valentine onto the cold steel floor, disarming him entirely, and hit the manual override. With a deafening hydraulic hiss, the massive 3-foot-thick vault door swung shut, locking them in absolute impenetrable isolation. The heavy thud of the locks engaging severed them from the chaos of the outside world. The emergency LED lights hummed to life, casting a pale clinical glow over the four of them. Outside, they could hear the muffled, distant sounds of the NYPD SWAT teams finally breaching the lobby. But inside the vault, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Damien leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. He didn't look at his wound. His dark eyes were entirely consumed by the trembling Omega sitting on the metal crates. Elliot was hyperventilating, his hands frantically roaming over his belly to ensure he hadn't been hit. When he realized he was unharmed, he finally looked up. His amber eyes met Damien's, and the raw, terrified silence stretched between them, heavy with 9 months of unspoken secrets. "You're bleeding," Elliot whispered, his voice cracking as he stared at the dark crimson stain spreading across Damien's pristine white shirt. "It's a graze," Damien replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stepped closer to Elliot, ignoring Lorenzo, who was currently zip-tying Valentine to a steel structural beam in the corner. Damien stopped just inches from Elliot. His imposing presence dwarfed him. Slowly, he reached out, his blood-stained hand hovering for a second before he gently brushed a strand of soot-covered hair from Elliot's face. Elliot flinched, but didn't pull away. 9 months, Damien said, the words barely more than a breath. The apex predator was gone. In his place was a man violently unspooled by the reality sitting in front of him. "You took the money. You disappeared. Why didn't you tell me?" Elliot let out a breathless, tearful laugh. "Tell you, Damien? Do you think I didn't try to find out who you were after that night at the Waldorf? I thought you were a hero, a businessman who saved my life. I went looking for a name to attach to the face in the dark." He swallowed hard, his hands tightening on his coat. "And I found it. I read the articles. I heard the rumors. You aren't just a CEO, Damien. You run half the criminal syndicate in the Northeast. You destroy people. You ruin lives." Damien's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. But he didn't deny it. "When I found out I was pregnant," Elliot continued, a tear slipping down his cheek, "I was terrified. I'm an Omega. I had no family, no protection. If I came to you, what would happen? Would you take my baby away? Would you raise him in a world filled with guns and blood and panic rooms? I couldn't let my child become a pawn in a Mafia war. So, I used your money. I changed my name. I moved to Queens. I tried to hide from you." "And yet," Damien murmured, his gaze dropping to Elliot's heavily rounded stomach, "here you are in my vault, caught in my war." "I needed to empty my mother's old safety deposit box," Elliot cried, gesturing to the wall of vaults. "It was a fluke. A horrible, impossible fluke." Damien slowly knelt on the cold steel floor, bringing himself to eye level with Elliot. He reached out, and this time he didn't hesitate. He placed his large, warm hand directly over Elliot's stomach. Elliot gasped softly at the contact. Beneath his palm, Damien felt a sudden, distinct kick. A jolt of electricity shot straight through his heart. It was a profound, earth-shattering realization. He was a man who commanded thousands of men, who moved billions of dollars across oceans, who dictated the life and death of his enemies with a nod. But nothing in his entire existence had ever felt as powerful as the tiny defiant kick of his unborn child against his hand. "You were wrong," Damien said, his voice dropping to a fierce territorial whisper. He looked up into Elliot's amber eyes. "I destroy my enemies, Elliot. I ruin the lives of those who threaten what is mine. But I protect my own. And you?" He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching Elliot's. "You are mine. This child is my heir, the bloodline of my empire. You will never have to hide again." You will never have to fear the dark again. I will build a fortress around you both that God himself couldn't breach." Elliot stared at him, breathless. The terrifying, ruthless alpha was offering him the one thing he had desperately wanted since that night at the Waldorf. Absolute, unwavering safety. "Boss," Lorenzo interrupted quietly, tapping his earpiece. "Matteo is in position. The subterranean breach is ready. SWAT is attempting to cut through the vault door from the lobby. We have about 4 minutes before they compromise the outer shell." Damien stood up smoothly, his face instantly reverting to a mask of tactical command. "Tell Matteo to blow the floor." "What about him?" Lorenzo asked, nodding toward the bleeding, semi-conscious Valentin Torres. "Leave him," Damien commanded coldly. "Let the feds have him. His empire is already dead, and he'll spend the rest of his miserable life in a supermax cell knowing he failed to touch my family." A muffled, rhythmic thumping began echoing from beneath the heavy steel floorboards of the vault. Suddenly, a section of the steel plating groaned, sparking as thermal lances cut through from the subway tunnels below. With a heavy clang, a 3-foot section of the floor dropped away, revealing a dark tunnel illuminated by tactical flashlights. Matteo, Damien's loyal underboss, popped his head through the opening, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries. "Your carriage awaits, boss. The convoy is waiting in the maintenance tunnels." Damien turned back to Elliot. He extended his hand to him. It was a silent vow, a contract signed in blood and survival. Elliot looked at his hand, then up at his dark, intense eyes. He knew stepping into that tunnel meant stepping fully into the underworld. But looking at the alpha who had just taken a bullet for him, who had shielded him with his own body, he knew there was no safer place on earth than by his side. He placed his small hand in Damien's. Damien pulled him gently to his feet, supporting his weight with an arm securely wrapped around his waist. They descended into the subterranean darkness, leaving the sirens, the blood, and the old world behind. The tunnel was narrow and damp, lit only by the tactical flashlights of Matteo's men. Damien kept one arm wrapped firmly around Elliot's waist, guiding him through the uneven terrain. The Omega stumbled once, and Damien caught him instantly, pulling him closer. "I've got you," Damien murmured against his ear. "I'm not letting go." Elliot trembled in his arms. His scent, honey and chamomile, was tinged with fear and exhaustion, but underneath it was something else. Something warm. Something that made Damien's alpha instincts purr with satisfaction. "You're really here," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought I'd never see you again." Damien's grip tightened. "I should have found you. I should have checked on you. I was so focused on destroying the Torres family, I let you slip away. You left me money and a note telling me to disappear," Elliot said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "What was I supposed to think?" Damien stopped walking, turning to face Elliot fully. The tunnel was dim, but he could see every detail of Elliot's face, the tear tracks on his cheeks, the exhaustion in his amber eyes, the way his hand instinctively rested on his belly. "I was trying to protect you," Damien said, his voice rough. "I thought the further you were from me, the safer you'd be. I didn't realize I was already a part of you. I didn't realize you were carrying my child." Elliot's lower lip trembled. "You didn't give me a choice, Damien. You made that decision for me. You left me in the dark with nothing but money and a piece of paper." "I know." Damien reached up, cupping Elliot's cheek with his bloodstained hand. "And I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't reach you." Elliot leaned into his touch, his eyes fluttering closed. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "I haven't been able to sleep properly in months. I keep dreaming about that night. About the dark. About you." Damien's heart clenched. He pulled Elliot into his arms, cradling him against his chest. "You'll never have to dream about the dark again," he promised. "I'll be there. Every night. I won't leave you." Elliot buried his face in Damien's shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. Damien held him, one hand splayed protectively over his pregnant belly, feeling the gentle movement of their child beneath his palm. "Boss," Mateo called from ahead. "We need to move. The feds are all over the tunnels." Damien nodded, gently pulling away from Elliot. "We're coming. Just stay close to me." They continued through the tunnel, emerging into a maintenance station where a fleet of black SUVs waited. Damien helped Elliot into the back of the lead vehicle, sliding in beside him. Lorenzo and Mateo took the front seats. "Where are we going?" Elliot asked, his voice small. "Somewhere safe," Damien replied. "Somewhere no one will find us." He pulled out his phone, sending a series of encrypted messages. Within minutes, the convoy was moving, weaving through the underbelly of Manhattan toward the outskirts of the city. Elliot leaned against Damien, exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Damien wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. "Sleep," Damien murmured. "I'll wake you when we arrive." "I can't," Elliot whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the gun. I see Valentine's face." Damien's jaw tightened. "He'll never touch you again. I swear it on my life." Elliot looked up at him, those amber eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me. We spent one night together. One night that changed everything," Damien replied. "I didn't know it then. I was too focused on my empire, on revenge, on control. But when I saw you in that bank, when I realized you were carrying my child, everything shifted." He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind Elliot's ear. "I've been alone my entire life, Elliot. I've never let anyone close. I've never trusted anyone. But you were different from the start. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe it was the fear. But I felt something that night that I've never felt before." "Fear?" Elliot asked. "Protection," Damien corrected. "A need to keep you safe. And that need has only grown stronger." Elliot was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and placed his hand over Damien's. "I was so scared to come to you," he admitted. "I told myself you wouldn't want me, that you'd see me as a liability, that you'd take my baby and throw me away." "I would never do that," Damien said fiercely. "Never. You are not a liability, Elliot. You are the most important person in my life. You and this child. I will burn the world to ashes to protect you." Elliot's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. "I don't know if I can trust you," he whispered. "But I want to. I want to so badly." Damien pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Then let me earn it. Let me prove to you that you can." The convoy arrived at a private helipad on the outskirts of the city. A sleek black helicopter waited, rotors already spinning. Damien helped Elliot out of the SUV, guiding him toward the aircraft. "This is insane," Elliot said, staring up at the helicopter. "I've never even been in a plane before." "You'll be fine," Damien assured him. "I'll be right next to you." They boarded the helicopter, and within minutes, they were airborne, the glittering lights of Manhattan shrinking beneath them. Elliot gripped Damien's hand, his knuckles white. Damien squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Look at me." Elliot tore his gaze away from the window, meeting Damien's eyes. "Focus on me," Damien said. "Breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth." Elliot followed his instructions, his breathing slowly steadying. Damien kept his eyes locked on him, a steady anchor in the chaos. "You're good at this," Elliot said, a shaky smile crossing his lips. "The whole calming people down thing." Damien smirked. "I've had a lot of practice. When you run a criminal empire, you learn how to keep people from panicking." Elliot laughed, a genuine laugh that made something warm bloom in Damien's chest. "I suppose that's useful." "It has its moments," Damien agreed. They flew for over an hour, finally landing on the grounds of a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. The property was surrounded by high walls and security cameras, patrolled by armed guards. The main house was a sprawling mansion, all glass and steel, overlooking the ocean. Elliot stared at it in awe. This is yours." "Ours," Damien corrected. "If you want it, it's yours now too." Elliot turned to him, eyes wide. "Damien, come inside," Damien said, taking his hand. Let's get you settled. The interior of the mansion was just as impressive as the exterior. Soaring ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture that was both elegant and comfortable. But Elliot barely noticed any of it. He was exhausted, his body aching from the ordeal. Damien led him to the master suite, a massive room with a king-sized bed and a view of the ocean. The guest rooms are down the hall if you'd prefer your own space, he said. But I'd rather you stay here, with me, so I can keep an eye on you. Elliot hesitated. His instincts as an Omega told him to accept the offer. The Alpha was providing safety, protection, but his heart was still wary. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted. It's a lot. All of this is a lot. Damien nodded, understanding. Then take the guest room. But I'll be right next door if you need me. And I'll have a security detail posted outside your door. Elliot's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. He allowed Damien to guide him to a guest room, equally luxurious as the master suite. Damien helped him out of his soiled coat and into a comfortable robe, then returned with a cup of warm tea. Sit, Damien commanded gently, guiding Elliot to the bed. Rest. I'll have a doctor come check on you and the baby tomorrow. You're really going to take care of us, aren't you? Elliot asked, accepting the tea. I told you, Damien replied, sitting beside him on the bed. I will build a fortress around you both. I'll do whatever it takes. Elliot studied his face, searching for deception, for false promises. But he found only sincerity in those dark eyes. Why? You're a billionaire. You're a crime boss. You could have anyone. Why me? Damien reached out, taking Elliot's hand in his. Because you're the only one who's ever made me feel human. In that dark room, when you were sobbing in my arms, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt needed. Not for my money. Not for my power. For me. And that terrified me. That's why I ran. He lifted Elliot's hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. I've been running my whole life, Elliot. Running from connection, running from vulnerability, running from the possibility of getting hurt. But I'm done running. I'm tired of being alone. And I want to build something with you. Something real. Elliot's eyes glistened with tears. I'm scared, he whispered. I've been scared for so long. I know, Damien said softly. And that's okay. I'll help you be brave. I'll help you remember what it feels like to feel safe. Just give me a chance, Elliot. That's all I'm asking. Elliot was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to Damien's. One chance, he whispered. Don't break my heart. I won't, Damien promised. I'll protect it with my life. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Damien kept his promise, surrounding Elliot with round-the-clock security and the best medical care money could buy. Dr. Harrison, a discreet Omega specialist, confirmed that the baby was healthy and due in just under a month. It's a boy, the doctor announced with a smile. Strong heartbeat. Perfect development. Elliot's face lit up with joy, and Damien felt his heart swell with pride. Have you thought about names? Dr. Harrison asked. We have, Damien replied, his hand resting on Elliot's belly. Leo Castellano. Elliot beamed at him, and Damien leaned down to press a kiss to his forehead. The baby came 3 weeks later, in the middle of the night. Elliot went into labor at 2 a.m., and Damien was instantly awake, his alpha instincts on high alert. Stay calm, he instructed, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The doctor is on his way. I'm right here, Elliot. I'm not going anywhere. Elliot's grip on his hand was vice-like, his face contorted with pain. It hurts, he gasped. It hurts so much. I know, baby, Damien murmured, pressing a kiss to his sweat-soaked forehead. But you're so strong. You've been through so much. You can do this. Hours later, after a labor that tested both of them, Leo Castellano was born. He was perfect, dark hair, tiny fingers, and a set of lungs that could rival a siren. The doctor placed him in Elliot's arms, and both parents wept. He's beautiful, Elliot whispered, gazing down at his son. He's so beautiful. Damien leaned over them both, one arm wrapped around Elliot, the other gently cradling Leo's head. He has your eyes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He's perfect. The next few months were the happiest of Damien's life. He had never imagined himself as a father, had never thought he could be soft or gentle. But Leo changed everything. The moment he held his son in his arms, something in him shifted. "I'm going to change," he told Elliot one night, sitting on the balcony overlooking the ocean. "I've already started dismantling the more problematic parts of my empire. I'm going to make my legacy something you can be proud of. Something Leo can be proud of." Elliot looked at him, his amber eyes soft with affection. "You're already someone to be proud of, Damien. You saved me. You saved our son. You've given us everything." "No," Damien replied, shaking his head. "You've given me everything. You gave me a reason to be better." He reached out, cupping Elliot's face in his hands. "I love you, Elliot. I know I didn't say it before. I was too scared, too stubborn. But I love you. I've loved you since that night in the dark." Elliot's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too," he whispered. "I was so afraid to admit it. But I do. I love you, Damien." They kissed, soft and tender, a promise of forever. 6 months later, the sprawling Castellano estate in the Hamptons bathed in the golden hour light of a warm autumn evening. The perimeter was secured by ex-military contractors, the airspace restricted, and the Castellano logistics empire had finalized its transition into a strictly legitimate global conglomerate. Damien had kept his promise. He had violently purged the remaining threats to his family, dismantled the syndicates that refused to fall in line, and scrubbed his legacy clean. On the sweeping mahogany balcony overlooking the private beach, Damien stood holding a small swaddled bundle in his arms. He looked down at the sleeping face of his infant son, Leo. The boy had Elliot's delicate features, but the dark, assessing eyes that occasionally blinked open were purely Castellano. Elliot stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping a cashmere shawl around his shoulders. He leaned against Damien, resting his head on his shoulder as they looked out at the ocean. "He's getting so big," Elliot murmured. "I can't believe how fast he's growing." "It's the Castellano genes," Damien teased. "We're a large breed." Elliot laughed, the sound like music to Damien's ears. "You're impossible. And yet you love me anyway." "I do," Elliot agreed, tilting his head up to look at Damien. "God help me, I do." Damien pressed a soft kiss to the crown of Elliot's head, his arm tightening around his waist. The ruthless king of New York had finally found the one treasure he couldn't lock in a vault, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure they ruled the world together. "I'm going to marry you," Damien said quietly. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. I'm going to make you mine in every way that matters." Elliot's breath caught. "Damien, I know you're not ready," Damien continued, his voice gentle. "But I want you to know it's coming. I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice. That you and Leo are the center of my world." Elliot buried his face in Damien's chest, his body shaking with quiet sobs. Damien held him close, rocking him gently. "I love you," Elliot whispered. "I love you so much it scares me." "It scares me too," Damien admitted. "But that's okay. We'll be scared together. That's what being a family means." He pressed another kiss to Elliot's head, then looked down at his sleeping son. Leo stirred, making a small cooing sound, and Damien felt his heart swell with an emotion he had never thought himself capable of: pure, unconditional love. Epilogue. 1 year later. The wedding was a small affair, held on the private beach of the Castellano estate. Only trusted friends and family were in attendance. Matteo as best man, Lorenzo and the security team as unofficial guests, and a handful of Elliot's friends from his floral design days. Elliot wore a white linen suit, simple and elegant, a crown of white orchids in his hair. Damien wore a dark navy Armani, his eyes never leaving his husband-to-be. "You look beautiful," Damien whispered as they stood at the altar. Elliot blushed, his cheeks flushing a delicate pink. "You don't look so bad yourself." The ceremony was short and sweet, presided over by a retired judge who owed Damien more than a few favors. When it came time for the vows, Damien took Elliot's hands in his. "Elliot," he began, his voice rough with emotion. When I first met you, I was a monster. I had built my empire on blood and fear, and I had convinced myself that was all I would ever be. But you changed me. You made me want to be better. You gave me a reason to hope, a reason to love." He paused, his jaw tightening with emotion. "I wasn't looking for you. I wasn't looking for anyone. But the universe gave you to me anyway, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. You are my mate, my partner, my everything. I vow to love you, protect you, and cherish you until my dying breath. And even after that, my soul will find yours in the next life." Elliot was crying openly now, his hands trembling in Damien's. "Damien, I don't know what I did to deserve you. You existed," Damien replied simply. "That's all you had to do." Elliot laughed through his tears. "I vow to love you too," he said, "to stand by you, to support you, and to remind you that you are so much more than your empire. You are a good man, Damien, the best man I know, and I am so proud to be yours." They kissed, sealing their vows, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Leo, now a year old and walking, tottered up to them, babbling incoherently. Damien scooped him up, holding him in one arm while wrapping the other around Elliot. "We're a family," Damien said, looking out at the ocean. "And no one is ever going to take that away from us." Elliot leaned into him, his heart full. "No one," he agreed. "Not ever." The sun set over the Hamptons, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Damien Castellano had started his life as a man defined by power and fear. But he had found something far more valuable, a love that had broken down all his walls, a family that gave his life purpose, and a future that was brighter than he had ever dared to dream. He was no longer just the billionaire mafia boss. He was a husband, a father, a protector, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure his family knew just how much they meant to him. The last thing Elliot saw before the darkness of a peaceful sleep claimed him was Damien's face, soft, content, and utterly in love. And Elliot smiled, knowing that he had finally found his home. The tray was heavy in his hands, but Elias Thorne had long stopped noticing the weight. 29 years old, with the calluses of 2 back-to-back shifts etched into his palms, he moved through the private dining room of an upscale Boston restaurant with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make himself invisible. His dark hair was swept back hastily, and his gray eyes, the kind that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, were fixed on the table in front of him, not out of fear, but because he had spent his entire life watching rather than being watched. For 5 years, he had poured coffee on time, wiped down tables, and never told a single soul a thing about his life. His coworkers called him the Ice Prince in the worn-out shoes, the Omega who thought he was too good for them. Not one of them ever bothered to learn that every Tuesday night after closing, he slipped off to a sign language class at the community center, so he could talk to his younger brother, the one who had lost part of his hearing to a fever when they were children. That was why, when Julian, the bitter shift manager with his perpetual sneer, assigned him to wait on the most feared customer in the place that Friday night, Elias saw only the way their eyes lit up like they had already decided something about him without asking. The customer was Dante Marchetti, 35 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and a faint scar running down his left cheekbone. His eyes were the color of winter storms, still, cold, and utterly unreadable. The whole restaurant whispered that he ran the underworld on the city's south side, that he came in alone every Friday to a closed room, tipped generously, and never answered a word to anyone. People said he was arrogant, said he faked being deaf to seem more important. And that was exactly the joke Julian and his crew had set up. They pushed the poorest Omega they had into that room and crouched behind the service door to watch him get ignored by the boss until he fled in humiliation. What none of them ever imagined was that Dante wasn't pretending at all. He truly hadn't heard a single sound since the explosion that took his father and his hearing 15 years before. He read lips off every face in front of him and guarded that secret like his life depended on it, because in his world, a weakness exposed was a death sentence. So when Elias set the tray down, read the menu, and got nothing back. He froze for just a couple of seconds. Then, instead of falling apart the way the whole crew was praying he would, he looked Dante dead in the eye, raised his calloused hands, and began to sign, slow and clear. Asterisk hello. I'm your server tonight. What would you like? Asterisk. For the first time in years, a stranger was speaking to Dante Marchetti in his own language. The notorious boss's head snapped up. That ice-cold stare cracked right down the middle. And behind the service door, 3 grinning faces twisted into confusion, unable to comprehend what those moving hands meant. Their petty show to humiliate a poor Omega had slipped out of their control, leaving them deeply frustrated and determined to watch him even closer in the weeks to come, entirely unaware that this was the beginning of something that would eventually leave every last one of them silent. Elias took off his apron close to midnight, walked to the bus stop beneath the drizzle of a Boston autumn, and let the city drift past behind the fog glass all the way back to the south side. His one-room apartment sat on the 4th floor of an old building with stairs that always smelled of damp and a hallway light that flickered even though the landlord had promised to fix it 3 winters ago. He opened the door very quietly, because he knew Leo was asleep. His 24-year-old brother had left the desk lamp on and a small note beside the rice pot saying he had saved a portion for him. Only a few crooked words, but enough to make Elias stand still for a while in the cramped kitchen. Because after a long day filled with faces that looked at him as though he were a piece of cheap furniture, that scrap of paper was the only thing reminding him that he was still a human being. Someone was waiting for him. Leo had lost part of his hearing after a fever when he was 7, and that event had long since belonged to a distant past. Neither of them saw it as a wound anymore, only as a silence they had learned to live beside. It was because of him that Elias first found his way to sign language classes, awkward at first with every movement of his hands, until little by little that language became the way the 2 siblings told each other things sound could not carry. Their mother had died years earlier after a long illness, while their father had searched for answers at the bottom of liquor bottles, and then one day quietly never came back. Elias didn't often tell these things to anyone, not because he was ashamed, but because he had learned early that every piece of his life he handed over could become something others used to define him. He worked 2 shifts, gathered every dollar in tips, and kept going. His avoidance of the post-shift gossip and late-night drinks only fueled the kitchen's resentment, cementing his reputation as an outcast who simply didn't belong. They saw his silence and hurried to name it coldness, when the truth was that he had never been cold. He was only careful. That night, he sat down at the dining table and quietly ate the portion of rice Leo had saved for him, now cold. And after what felt like an eternity, his mind did not feel as empty as it usually did, because all the way home, he had kept thinking about the eyes of the man in the private room. Eyes the entire restaurant whispered were as cold as ice, yet in which he had seen something very different when he lifted his hands and spoke to him in his own language. He did not yet know that behind a crack in the door, 3 faces had been waiting to watch him fall apart. He only knew that for a few brief minutes, a stranger had looked at him not as if he were an object, but as if he were a human being. And that, though he did not yet dare name it, had slipped like a small beam of light into the walls he had spent so long building. Tuesday evening was the only night of the week when Elias allowed himself to step outside the cycle of 2 shifts. It was the night he went to sign language class at the community center at the end of a quiet street on the south side of the city. An old room with plastic chairs arranged in a circle and a whiteboard still faintly marked by old ink. But to him, it was almost the only place where he felt he could breathe. The teacher was a deaf Omega named Mrs. Adeline Sullivan, who never taught sign language as a list of movements to memorize, but as a language with breath, with nuance, with facial expression and silence. She often said with her hands that hands knew how to tell the things the throat kept hidden. That evening, Mrs. Adeline signed a question to the whole class, asking what made each person stay with this difficult language. When it was Elias's turn, he lifted his hands and slowly told them that he learned so that every night when he came home, He could still ask his brother how his day had been and receive a full answer, not just a passing nod. That he learned so Leo would never have to feel abandoned alone inside his own silence. When he lowered his hands, the whole room went still for a beat. Mrs. Adeline looked at him for a long time, then signed that Elias was not only learning this language, he was keeping a promise. On the way home, he thought about the previous Friday evening, about the man in the private room, and the moment he lifted his hands to speak with him. He realized it was the first time the language he had kept only for Leo had stepped outside and reached a stranger. And strangely, that did not make him feel as though he had lost something. It made him feel as though something had been connected again. When he got home, Leo was still awake, sitting at the table and sketching technical drawings for his trade class. Seeing his brother come in, he looked up and signed to ask how class had been. Elias sat down across from him, and, instead of telling him about the class, he signed the story of a guest at the restaurant who had unexpectedly understood the language the two siblings shared. Leo raised his eyebrows with curiosity, then laughed and teased him in signs, saying that finally someone else in the world could talk to him the way he did. Elias laughed with him, a rare light laugh. But even inside that warm moment, he could not have known that the Friday evening that seemed so accidental had actually been a trap laid in advance. As those Friday nights in the private room became a quiet routine, the initial shock of their first meeting dissolved into something deeper. The man seated at the head of the table no longer looked at Elias as a mere server, and Elias no longer saw him as a distant stranger. With each passing week, their conversations grew naturally. Dante set his glass down very slowly, and every movement he made was firm and precise, like someone who had lived with silence long enough to turn it into a language of his own flesh and blood. Elias, who had once frozen in nervousness, now found himself speaking freely about his life, replying that he had learned sign language to speak with his younger brother, someone who also lived in a world with less sound than other people. Dante nodded, without pity, without one of those hollow exclamations people usually made when they heard stories like that. During one of their first evenings together, Dante signed, *, you came here to serve, not to be sent in as a pawn, *. That sentence had made Elias realize the man in front of him was far sharper than the cold appearance the whole restaurant whispered about. During their dinners, Elias would sign the dishes on the menu, and when he once accidentally mentioned that the soup had probably cooled a little because it had been left too long on the counter, Dante lifted one eyebrow and answered with his hands, *, I can't hear the noise of this whole city anyway. So if a bowl of cold soup complains a little, I won't hear that either. So we're even, *. Elias laughed, the sound escaping before he could stop it. A real laugh he had let fall in this workplace after so many months, because he had not expected the man everyone feared to have such a dry, sly humor hidden behind that calm face. Dante saw his smile, and something in his eyes softened, as if the icy coldness Elias had heard so much about was only the outer shell of someone far too used to no one bothering to truly speak with him. The service that was supposed to last only 5 minutes, taking his order and leaving, now regularly stretched much longer. Dante asked about Leo, about his trade school, and Elias told him a few careful things. Just enough. Then Dante signed that most people who sat across from him chose to speak very loudly and very slowly, as if volume could cure everything, or worse, turned to speak to the person beside him as if he weren't even in the room. Elias washed his hands intently, realizing that what he was describing was exactly what he felt every day in this restaurant. The feeling of being present right there, and yet still somehow invisible. Two strangers in a private room suddenly found in each other a shared language wider than the movements of their hands. The understanding of two people used to being looked at without truly being seen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the door, where a narrow crack opened toward the service corridor, the three faces that had expected a one-time humiliating scene were growing more frustrated by the day. They had stood there with half smiles, waiting for the poor Omega to stumble. But week after week, All they witnessed was two pairs of hands answering each other in smooth rhythm, the laughter of someone they had been certain would cry, and the gaze of a boss everyone believed was cold, fixed carefully on every movement of the server they had pushed inside as a joke. Inside, Elias was completely unaware of the malicious audience that had just dispersed. He only felt time passing strangely fast, and when he finally left the room to return to work, he had no idea that the evening he thought was only an ordinary shift had quietly changed something very large, not only inside him, but also inside the man everyone believed had closed himself off completely. The sense of relief and warmth from that private room stayed with Elias through the rest of the shift. He carried dishes, cleared tables, wiped down the counter with an energy he had not felt in a long time. His mind still holding the echo of his own laughter and the way that man had looked at him as if he were a human being instead of a shadow. But that happiness, as he would soon realize, lasted only until the exact moment he stepped down into the dishwashing area behind the kitchen to put away the last stack of trays before clocking out. There, hidden behind the rows of stainless steel racks and the sound of running water, Julian and Miranda were standing and laughing together. And because they did not know he had come close, the words they let fall were not guarded at all. Miranda was wiping her hands and giggling as she said she had thought the Omega would just stand there like a statue and then run out sobbing. Who would have guessed? While Julian gave a frustrated, bitter laugh and answered that all their planning had been completely ruined. He complained that week after week, they had been wasting their time standing outside the crack in the door, constantly waiting to see him embarrass himself with that stone-deaf boss, only to get nothing. Hearing those careless, joking sentences, the painful reality of that Friday night suddenly pierced through Elias with absolute clarity. The puzzle pieces finally fell into place. The malicious smirks, the sudden assignment, their calculated silence. He hadn't been given a difficult shift by chance. He and the unsuspecting guest had been served up as a cheap spectacle for their co-workers' twisted entertainment. Elias stood frozen behind the rack, the stack of trays still in his hands, and he felt the warm happiness that only minutes before had filled his heart begin to harden, then sour inside his chest. Thick and bitter, like something beautiful left too long in the open air until it spoiled before it could be saved. But what hurt the most, strangely enough, was not that he had been turned into a joke, because he was used to being dismissed, used to eyes treating him like furniture. A joke aimed at him was something he could endure and let pass, as he had let so many things pass before. What truly chilled him and stirred a slow anger inside him was that they had dragged that man into their joke without thinking of him for even 1 second as a human being. They called him that stone-deaf boss with a laughing tone, as if the fact that he could not hear was a flaw worth using for entertainment. They had taken the very part of him he kept most hidden, the part he had to protect, as if protecting his own life, and used it as material for a cheap little performance. Elias thought of Leo and how he had fought all his life, so his brother would never be turned into a joke simply because he lived in a world with fewer sounds. He realized with a chilling certainty that if he hadn't stepped up to sign, a completely innocent man would have been left sitting in silent discomfort, targeted by a cruelty he couldn't even hear coming. He did not step forward. He did not speak. He did not let Julian and Miranda know that he had heard everything, because he knew the anger inside him, if released now, would only become a noisy argument that would fade without changing anything. He quietly set the trays down, turned away, and on the entire ride home that night, he no longer thought about the warm laughter inside the private room. He thought only of one question, returning again and again in his mind. How many times in life were people willing to turn another person's dignity into entertainment simply because they believed that person would never know? And whether he could keep walking silently past this, as he had always walked silently past everything else. All that week, Elias carried that slow-burning anger with him like a small stone in his coat pocket. Not heavy enough to make him collapse, but sharp enough that every time he touched it, it hurt. He still came to work on time, still wiped the tables clean, still kept himself closed off. And he had almost convinced himself that that Friday night had only been one more incident that would pass like everything else. Until the very next Friday evening, when Dante appeared again at the restaurant door with his familiar calm stride. This time, instead of silently walking straight into the room at the end of the hallway as usual, he stopped at the host's stand, looked directly at Julian, and with a brief handwritten note requested by name the server from last Friday night to serve him privately. No one else. Elias stood a few steps away and clearly saw Julian's face change. His usual mocking expression vanished, replaced by the awkwardness of a man who had just realized the joke he had set up had turned back in a direction he could no longer control. He glanced at Elias for a moment, then gave a stiff nod. And so Elias carried the tray back into that private room, this time with an entirely different state of mind. No longer the person pushed inside to be a joke, but the person chosen by the guest himself. When he closed the door and turned toward him, Dante signed for him to sit down for a moment, saying that he wasn't used to letting the person across from him stand while he had a conversation. Elias hesitated, because that went against every rule of the job. But something in those winter storm eyes made him set the tray down and sit on the edge of the chair. Then Dante began to tell him slowly, and clearly something he could feel he had not told many people. He signed and asked whether Elias knew why this whole city whispered that he only pretended to be deaf to seem important. And without waiting for his answer, he answered himself, saying that he let that rumor lie, that he had even felt relieved when people believed it. Because in the world he lived in, a rumor about arrogance was harmless, while the truth about a weakness could make a man pay dearly. He told him that he had not heard a single sound since an event many years earlier, the day an explosion took his father from him and took his hearing along with it. He spoke of it calmly, as if speaking of some distant winter, without self-pity, without exaggeration, only as a truth he had learned to live beside. He lifted his hand and touched the faint scar running along his cheekbone, then signed that people looked at this scar and imagined all kinds of dramatic underworld stories. But to him, it was only what remained of the day he lost many things at once and was forced to grow up overnight. He said that after that, he learned to read the lips of everyone around him, learned to observe so carefully that no one realized he was compensating for what he lacked. And he hid it so completely that only a few of the most trusted people beside him knew the truth. Because in his world, revealing a weakness was no different from signing his own sentence. Elias listened with all his eyes, and he understood that the man before him was giving him something more precious than ordinary trust. He was placing in his hands the very part of himself he had spent his whole life protecting. Elias signed, and asked why he would tell all this to a server he had only met once. Dante looked at him for a moment, then answered that it was because Elias was the first person in many years to walk into this room and speak to him, as if he were an ordinary human being, not a frightening boss or a pitiful cripple. That he did not speak louder, did not speak slower, did not pity him, and did not fear him. He had simply talked to him, and that was so rare that Dante had almost forgotten what it felt like. As he said that, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly into a very small smile. The first smile Elias had ever seen on that cold face. A fleeting smile, but enough for Elias to feel the wall between them move back a little more. And in that moment, Elias realized that the anger he had carried all week had not softened. It had only changed into something else, a quiet wish that this man, whoever he might be in the outside world, deserved to be treated with more kindness than the people hiding behind the crack in the door had shown him. After that Friday night, something Elias had not expected began quietly unfolding around him. Because the fact that the restaurant's most powerful and mysterious guest had specifically requested one single server was not the sort of thing that could stay hidden for long in a place where people lived on whispers. Within a few days, the way his coworkers looked at him had changed. It was no longer only the dismissive look they had once given the ragged little Omega, but something mixed with curiosity, scrutiny, and in some of them, jealousy. They began to notice that every Friday night, he was called into the room at the end of the hallway, that he stayed inside much longer than an ordinary service would require, and that when he came out, there was a strange calmness on his face that they could not explain. The person most irritated by that change was none other than Julian. His cruel scheme had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking Elias's spirit for a shared laugh, he had inadvertently elevated him. Watching the very Omega he sought to humiliate become the preferred confidant of the restaurant's most formidable guest ate away at his pride day by day. Julian began doing what prideful people often do when they cannot bear to see someone they look down on rise above them. He began planting suggestive comments. At first only a few sentences tossed out as if by accident during busy moments in the kitchen. Saying it was strange, wasn't it, that some Omega with nothing special about him had suddenly caught the boss's eye. That who knew what the two of them were doing in that private room. Those half-joking, half-serious remarks were dropped by him at exactly the moments when many people were around. Vague enough that he could deny them and claim he was only having fun, but poisonous enough to plant a distorted image of Elias in the minds of those listening. Miranda, who had already disliked Elias, immediately joined in, adding color and venom to every rumor until the original story had been twisted many times over through every mouth that passed it along. And just like that, the name Elias, belonging to an Omega who had spent his whole life wanting only to be left in peace and remain invisible, suddenly became the hottest subject of gossip in the kitchen after the dinner rush. The cruel irony was that the quieter he remained, the more he refused to explain himself, the more those spreading the rumors interpreted his silence as a confession. In the midst of that thickening atmosphere, one person began to feel uneasy. That was Owen, the youngest waiter in the group, the one who had also stood behind the crack in the door with Julian and Miranda that Friday night to join in the joke. Owen was not a cruel person. He was only young and weak-willed, easily swept along by the crowd, and afraid of becoming the outsider. But as he watched the rumor drift farther and farther from what he had once thought was only harmless teasing, as he saw it begin to aim at Elias's dignity in a way that grew harder and harder to hear, something inside him started to ache with guilt. He remembered Elias's calm face when he stepped out of the room, remembered that during all these weeks, he had done nothing to deserve words like that. And he began to dimly realize that he had helped create something unkind, even if all he had done was stand there and laugh along. Owen still did not have enough courage to speak up. He remained silent whenever Julian made another remark, still lowering his face and avoiding Elias's eyes whenever he passed him. But the uneasiness inside him kept growing like a seed planted in the wrong place. And although he did not know it yet, that slow-gnawing guilt would later become the thing that made all the difference. Despite the whispers circling around him outside that room, the Friday evenings in the room at the end of the hallway kept arriving steadily. And little by little, they became a stretch of time Elias, though he would not admit it even to himself, quietly began to look forward to. Because it was the only place where he was not the ragged little Omega or the subject of kitchen gossip, but simply a human being listened to. And if the last time had been Dante opening himself enough to tell him the thing he hid most deeply, then this time, for reasons Elias did not fully understand, he found himself wanting to speak. Perhaps because he had seen Dante offer him his truth, he felt it would be unfair to keep hiding forever behind his own wall. That day, when Dante signed and asked why someone as young as he was had chosen to live so closed off, Elias stayed silent for a long while, then slowly lifted his hands and began to tell him. He told him that there had once been a time when he had not been this way, that once there had been someone he trusted enough to tell everything about his life, someone he had seen as a refuge during the hardest days. And because he had placed his trust so completely in that person, he had not been on guard when they asked to borrow the money he had saved $1 at a time for months. Money he had set aside for something important connected to his younger brother. Then one day, that person disappeared with all of it, without a single explanation, leaving him with empty hands and a lesson he never wanted to learn again. He signed that what had hurt him most was not losing the money. Money could be earned again by taking extra shifts. What broke him was realizing that he had trusted the wrong person, that the softest part of himself, the part he had opened to someone, had been used by that very person to wound him. And from then on, he learned to build walls. Not because he was cold the way people thought, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if he opened himself one more time, the next wound might be one he could not rise from. Dante watched every movement of his hands without interrupting once, without rushing to comfort him, without offering empty advice. He only looked at him with eyes that told him he understood. Then Elias went on and told him about Leo, about his 24-year-old brother who was studying a trade, about the fever when he was little that had taken part of his hearing and turned his world into a place with fewer sounds than other people's. He told him that Leo was the reason he had found his way to sign language, that the money he had been tricked out of years ago had been meant for him, and that no matter how much life took from him, he had always told himself he would never let his brother feel abandoned alone inside his own silence. When he spoke of Leo, something changed in Dante's eyes. He sat a little straighter, more attentive, because this was the first time he had heard about that younger brother, about the true reason a poor Omega could be fluent in the very language he had been forced to live with all his life. And he realized that Elias's speaking hands were not a lucky accident, but the result of years of quiet love. He lifted his hands and signed a sentence Elias would remember for a long time afterward, that most people believed listening belonged to the ears, but he knew better than anyone that there were people who could hear every sound in the world and still never truly hear another person, while there were others who could not hear a single sound and yet listen more clearly than anyone else. When he finished signing, they both fell silent, a silence that was not awkward at all, but strangely warm, as if inside that private room, two people who were used to hiding behind walls had just realized that they were seeing each other in a way very few people in their lives ever had. Two wounds from two different lives. One person closed off because his trust had been betrayed, the other lonely in the middle of his own power. And yet when they reflected each other, they did not deepen the pain. Strangely, they eased it a little. Elias left that room that night with a feeling he had not had in a very long time. The feeling that perhaps not every open door led to a new wound. That perhaps there were still people in this world worth stepping past his own wall for. Worth trusting one more time.